and we'll just hopefully make this a bit more interactive. But I'm just curious to get a sense for folks' familiarity here. If you have heard of behavioral insights or behavioral science before, could you drop a 1 in the chat? And if you haven't, could you drop a 2? Just to get a sense of like where folks are coming from. It's always interesting. Okay, so seeing a bit of a mix. Hopefully for the folks who've heard of it before, you'll get something out of this anyway, but it's really useful to get that from folks. So I just a little bit about myself. My name is Michael Kaemingk. As Kate said, I'm a principal advisor of the Behavioral Insights team based in New York, and I lead our work with state and local governments in the US. I've been with BIT for about 5.5 years at this point and have worked across our subject areas and geographies, everything from working with co-creating teacher and education-based training programs for refugees in Tanzania, to working on how to mitigate the spread of misinformation, to working on the take-up of local government programs like Safe Streets and others. Like, I've sort of been all over the place in that regard, and I'm super excited to be talking to you today. So just an overview of what we'll do today. I'm going to introduce BIT and the concept of behavioral science first, and this may be review for some of you, but hopefully we'll just set the table and make sure we're all on the same page regardless. I'm going to give an intro to BIT's EAST framework after that, which is like the framework that we use for introducing people to how to use behavioral science to think about solution or intervention development, since I know that's the sort of part in the series where this session sits. I'm going to share as a part of that some examples of behavioral science applied in practice. And then at the end, we'll have 30 minutes to chat about your issues and what you're dealing with and how behavioral science might interact with your work. And I am willing to put money on that being the most interesting part of today's session, but hopefully I can do okay in these first 60 minutes as well. But as I said, if you have questions about what I'm presenting or observations, comments, drop them in the chat, and that will be super exciting for me. So BIT is a bit of an interesting company in that we actually started as a part of the UK Prime Minister's office, so in the Cabinet Office in 2010, and we were one of the first groups in government that was dedicated to applying behavioral science to the design of public policy and programs. We spun out as a global social purpose company a couple of years later and have since opened offices all over the world and worked all over the world, including in the US. We've, at this point, run over 1,000 behavioral insights projects in 60 countries, including more than 800 randomized controlled trials, which I'll talk a bit more about what that is in a moment. And we've trained over 12,000 civil servants and practitioners in a behavioral insights approach to varying degrees. Our existing projects and footprint in the US includes working with more than 60 cities as a part of the What Works Cities program, which helps cities become more evidence-based and data-driven in decision-making. It includes work with federal government agencies. It includes work with states and groups like the National Governors Association. So we come from government, we've worked with government abroad and in the US, and so we certainly have a real deep background in applying behavioral science to government specifically. Our approach is basically twofold. One is we take behavioral science, so the study of how humans make choices and behave in real world contexts, and apply that to the designs of policy and programs. So we try to understand how humans actually behave, not how we want them to behave, and bring that to bear in how we're communicating or structuring policies or programs for users. And then the second big piece of what we do is rigorous evaluation. So we almost always try to rigorously evaluate any solution we develop in partnership with clients, often using randomized controlled evaluations, sometimes using other methods. But we want to understand, if we made a change based on the behavioral science evidence, did it actually lead to a change in the outcome that we were trying to move or not? Like, did it work or not? what do we mean by behavioral insights? So just to start, to set the table on the concept for everyone, this may be review for some. So I think historically, and if you studied economics like I did, a lot of times when folks are taking undergrad economics, at least, humans, you're introduced to this sort of rational actor model, where oftentimes in these economic models, humans are assumed to be these like utility maximizing robots who always do what's in their best interest. Or as some of you might recognize here, something along the lines of Dr. Spock, of like always acting rationally, coherently, like having rational preferences and always being able to, work through all the information they're presented with and come to an action or a decision that's in their best interest. But I mean, you all know from your own lives that that is not necessarily an accurate picture of humanity. It's definitely not an accurate picture of me. I want to go to the gym. Do I always follow through on doing that? No, I definitely do not. Um, uh, I intended to submit a list for a grocery delivery this morning. Did I do that? No. When I do that, do I often miss something that I regularly need? Yes. Like, we're just busy. We have a lot going on, and we are sort of susceptible to a set of heuristics and biases that make it such that it's difficult for us to always like act rationally. Not to say that acting rationally is always the best thing to do. So in that sense, like, behavioral science recognizes that reality, and it's the study of how humans make decisions and behave in real world context. And we want to update that sort of model of the human being as a rational decision maker, and look at the ways our brains actually work and the shortcuts we take when making decisions, or that our brain takes in helping us navigate this world. A key concept here in the field that you may know already if you've read the book Thinking Fast and Slow or other kind of literature in this space is the dual process theory of cognition. Now, my neuroscience colleagues would emphasize that this is not literally like physical features of the brain. It's just a helpful way of thinking about the brain. So just to be clear about that. But with that caveat in place, system one is this sort of fast thinking, automatic, intuitive, kind of effortless parallel process, like means of thinking. And like, I think the way to illustrate what this feels like is thinking about your daily commute. Like, oftentimes you can kind of do that on automatic. For me, it's, walking to the subway, getting on the right stop, getting off the right stop, catching a shuttle to our office. Like, you can do other things, you can think about other things. You don't have to exert a lot of mental energy to actually doing that. Another way of thinking about it is like, if I ask you the question, what's 2 times 2, the answer is going to pop into your head without really any effort on your part. System 2 is this more slow thinking, reflective, deliberate, kind of analytical system we have that you can exercise in, planning and your work and your life to like, it takes a lot of energy to exercise this and to focus, but like 24 times 17, like, unless you've memorized multiplication tables beyond what I was asked to memorize in school, you probably don't know the answer to that, and you'd have to sit there and kind of work through it for a minute. Or if you're planning a trip or a vacation overseas, you'd have to spend a lot of time kind of thinking deeply about that. There is no, like, I'm not making, and I don't think others make, a value judgment between system 1 and system 2. Like, I think if we were forced to think deliberatively about every single decision we made, this life would be impossible to navigate and to get through. So I'm personally thankful that we have this like machinery that can help us simplify and make the right decision most of the time without too much effort. But I think it's really useful to have this background. And as policymakers, as program designers and implementers, it's useful to kind of think through that as Daniel Kahneman says, who's the author of Thinking Fast and Slow, it turns out that environmental effects on behavior are a lot stronger than most people affect. And this is because, we're often in this sort of system one mode, and system one is sort of present for us and has these like heuristics and biases that affect the decisions we make and how we navigate this world. So I think like that's a useful primer for and if this catches your interest, it's definitely worth looking at that book. But the main takeaway here is that understanding how people behave in practice helps us design better policies and services. So I think a lot of, just in the time that I've been at BIT, I've seen government and other social impact groups get a lot better at this. But I think, it's easy for anyone here probably to think of an example where a program or a policy or a way of interacting with a program was sort of designed for Dr. Spock or a highly rational person who's going to get through all the paperwork they need to get something. And it's, I think, useful to reflect on that. That may not be optimal, and that may not be a program designed for Dr. Spock is not going to serve all users as maybe as well as it could. So just setting the table a little bit more on behavioral insights before we get to examples of this in practice. It basically has three core features. One, rigorous evidence about human behavior from the literature, from other researchers, from fields like anthropology, behavioral economics, psychology, etc. Second, using that evidence and having a real practical application and pragmatic focus towards making a difference for people and making improvements in folks' lives. So sometimes the behavioral science literature is focused on important but kind of theoretical or academic questions about human behavior. In case of behavioral insights, we really care about using this evidence to make a difference for folks, regardless of whether it's sort of academically interesting. And then, as I said earlier, we always want to bring a kind of robust evaluation approach, which I'll talk about more in a moment. When you think about behavioral insights, a lot of the examples I'm going to share today are kind of like examples of how you might immediately start to introduce behavioral insights in your work. And so they feel pretty simple and straightforward. But I wanted to call attention to and just sort of say that behavioral insights can be used in a number of ways to enrich traditional policy and program design and process improvement tools. Couple of these categories I've listed here: for information provision, so thinking about how you're presenting information to folks, what information you're presenting; environment design, so the physical environment, like is it setting up folks for success? Is it designed in the best interest of the users? Process design, financial incentives or other incentives, or even applying this behavioral science to more systematic rules and regulation. So there are a number of different ways that it can be applied, even though a lot of the examples that I'm going to share are information oriented. So for the Department of Transportation person, whose name I forget, who introduced themselves earlier, there are definitely a lot of interesting work right now in applying behavioral science to design in the physical environment when it comes to keeping drivers and pedestrians safe, as well as information provision in that space. There's a lot of work being done to apply behavioral science to process design, even when it comes to the policy-making process. Like, how can we make sure that we're helping policymakers not be biased in their decision-making when they're developing policy. So there's a lot of space to apply behavioral insights in these different ways, and always happy to talk with folks in more depth. But the examples that I'm presenting today will be much more in line with what behavioral science sort of originally became known for, which is this concept of nudging, or light touch changes to the information or decision environment that help people make better decisions for themselves without being coercive or actually removing the fact that there is a decision that this person can make without removing their autonomy. So Nudge is a great additional book that's kind of foundational in the field, that's been would be interesting reading for folks alongside Thinking Fast and Slow. While, as I just emphasized, these like nudging isn't everything at this point. These approaches can make a big difference. These sorts of small changes, as you'll see in our examples today. Some of the, like one of the most famous examples of this is work in the UK that applied an insight, which I'll introduce today, called changing the default to workplace pensions, where for most employees, when they joined a company, they had to opt into this retirement savings vehicle. And some researchers ran an experiment where they tested, instead of having folks opt in to saving for retirement, they had folks opt out. So you're basically defaulted into savings unless you say, I don't want to be a part of this. So folks still had the decision of whether to participate in this or not, but just changing that default increased the percentage of workers that were saving for retirement, as you can see by the graph, by a huge percentage here, and made this sort of meaningful difference for their financial well-being and readiness to retire. So these approaches can make a big difference, but they're not the end-all, be-all for behavioral science. So that's setting the table on behavioral insights as a kind of high-level concept. Again, if you want to ask questions in the chat, either directly to me or to everyone about the kind of big picture concept, please do. While you think about that, I'll take a brief drink of water before I move on. But don't be shy if questions come up. Please put them in the chat. So how do we know what works? Like once we've actually applied behavioral science to a given question, how do we know if it worked or not? One of my favorite parts about being in this field is that we almost always run rigorous evaluations, as I said, and the kind of basic, or the tool we use most often is a randomized controlled trial, where we have a group of people who are like who we would call a sample, who are associated with a given question. So let's say, apropos my earlier comment about not being able to get to the gym as much as I like, let's say you're trying to encourage people to follow through on their gym commitments, and you have this group of people. What we would do in an RCT is split them at random into 2 or more groups. And if you have enough people, you can basically be certain that those 2 groups will be statistically similar. So they'll have the same number of people who eat eggs for breakfast in the morning in both groups, the same number of people who are highly motivated in each group, the same number of people across the spectrum of gender identities in both of the groups. Basically, these groups will be so statistically similar that we can be sure that any difference in outcomes we observe in these groups comes back to and is attributable to our intervention. So one group would get the business as usual. So maybe the business as usual communication that gym sends to its members about visiting the gym. Maybe that's no communication, maybe it's something. And then the other group could get any sort of number of interventions, or an intervention based on behavioral science. Like, let's say, in line with what some researchers have done recently, we ask people what days of the week they're going to go to the gym, and then that morning we send them a reminder about going to the gym. Or in this study, they actually paid people small amounts, like 9 cents or something, to go to the gym. At the end of whatever our period is, let's say we try this for a month, we can look at the difference in outcomes between these 2 groups. So how many people in the intervention group went to the gym, how many people in the control group went to the gym. And if there's a meaningful difference, like if there's a large enough difference, depending on how big our sample is, between the outcomes in these groups, we can know with certainty that it was our intervention that caused the difference. So that's for folks who aren't familiar with A/B tests or randomized controlled trials, or RCTs, that's the kind of basic evaluation tool that we try to use in a low-cost way to measure whether what we're doing works or not. just even though the rest of today's session is more about applying behavioral science to solution development, I wanted to note that we think that evaluation is really important, and it's best to evaluate when you can, because common sense is not enough. There are lots of examples of programs that intuitively seem like they might work, or policymakers might think would work, but then upon evaluation, we know that they don't work. So one example is a study. I don't know if you all had this when you were growing up in school and in health class, but there's always some variation on like giving kids a like fake baby to care for, like a watermelon or like a flour, or like a bag of flour, or like a robot baby or something. And the idea is that doing this, having this experience is supposed to make you realize how much work it is to have a kid, and thus try to deter teen pregnancy. An egg, yeah, I've heard that one too. And intuitively, it seems like this might work. Researchers in Australia found when they did a randomized controlled trial, so they tested it in some schools and not others, it actually increased the rate of teen pregnancy. There are some questions about why that is. Like maybe it demystified the process a little bit for some people. Like I don't know that the researchers know the actual mechanism there, but it seemed like a good idea intuitively. Turns out it didn't have the effect that the designers wanted. There's another, like more, again, I'm sort of anchored on the transportation person who so nicely introduced themselves. There's a recent paper in Nature or Science that I'll send you that looks at the Texas Department of Transportation implementing a traffic fatality messaging on highways starting in 2012, where with these big digital displays, they basically said, X number of people have died on this road in the last however many days. And they thought that by drawing people's attention while they're driving to that fact, it make people more responsible or better drivers in the moment. And they actually found that that message increased crashes on that roadway by 4.5%. And this is a common, I think, tactic that at least 20 other states have implemented at some point or another. So drawing attention in that key moment where folks are having to make decisions at high speed, like it is probably too successful in drawing their attention. And so I think evaluations is super important. I know that we are not in the like problem discovery part of the series. I will say just briefly that behavioral science does have a toolkit for identifying what we would call behavioral barriers. And I'll make a website available to you all as a follow-up if you want to explore this. But oftentimes before we do solution development, we're using this framework called COM-B to diagnose behavioral barriers, or what we think might be preventing people from doing what we want or what they want. Basically, in order to be able to perform a behavior, people have to have the capability to do that, the opportunity to do it, and the motivation to do it. And if one of these pieces is compromised or missing, it's unlikely they'll be able to perform the behavior. I've got some examples here that can be distributed in the slides afterwards that I'm not going to go over in detail. But when we are doing solution development, we're trying to tailor the solution to address what we think are the most important barriers preventing someone from undertaking a behavior. So just a quick note there. And usually how we do this is through a combination of kind of mixed methods research, including looking at administrative data. So I know a lot of you for your programs will have a lot of data around how your users are behaving. You can use that oftentimes to see their specific steps in a process that people are falling out, or to try and figure out, where things are difficult for folks. Oftentimes we'll do observations, so some qualitative research and actually watching people go through a process, or going through it ourselves, and doing a sort of secret shopper where we're like testing something as a user to see, can I actually do this? or not. Sometimes we'll do qualitative interviews, so talking to frontline staff, learning from their experience, talking to end users, learning from their experience to try to diagnose these barriers. And oftentimes we'll look at secondary research. So there's a lot of great rigorous research out there in the academic literature from other practitioners or policymakers that we can look at to see if anyone has tackled this problem or a similar one before. I'm seeing some questions come through.
They are coming through, Michael, and just due to time, I thought I'd just hold them for the Q&A because I feel like you could have an hour-long discussion minimum. So we've captured them, and please add more because they are fantastic questions.
Okay, perfect. So we'll definitely come back to them, Bonnie, and I would love to hear more from you about the kind of problem space before I respond to that. But the short answer is yes, which I know will be unsatisfying for now. So once we have a sense of like what those barriers are to performing a target behavior, and a sense of like what behaviors we really care about and think, lead up to an overall policy goal in our sort of theory of change, we then use behavioral science to develop solutions or interventions. And this mnemonic that I'm introducing is not perfectly comprehensive, but I think it's useful for categorizing common types of solutions that can be developed using behavioral science. So the mnemonic here, the framework is EAST. So if you want someone to do something, make it easy, make it timely, make it easy, make it attractive, make it timely, make it social. So what I'm going to do now is sort of go through each of those categories and provide a definition and some examples for how you might apply it, just to get you thinking about how this might be applicable to your work. And again, if you've got questions you want to pin, please put them in the chat. If you have questions about concepts in real time, put them in the chat. All right. The first thing, and I think the easiest one to grasp, is if you want someone to do something, make it easy. Examples of making it easy include defaults, removing friction costs, and simplifying messages. So I think defaults have been one of the most robust and most impactful levers that has been studied as a part of the behavioral science literature in the last 20 years. Basically, like the pension example or the retirement savings example I shared earlier, if you can change default, that can have a really powerful impact on a person's behavior, even if you're not actually removing any sort of autonomy or decision-making from that person. So opting them in to save for retirement unless they opt out is one example. Automatic voter registration is another example of a super powerful default. So I think, Oregon, the state of Oregon had a pre-automatic voter registration had something that like 8% of people were automatically registered, or only 8% of people who were automatically registered to vote opted out. So less than 1 in 10 people. And in the first 6 months of having made voter registration automatic, they registered about 200,000 previously unregistered voters. To put that in perspective, I think prior to automatic voter registration, they were registering about 2,000 people per month. So around 40% of those folks who were registered went on to vote then in the 2016 presidential election, and just provides, again, in addition to the retirement savings example, how powerful defaults can be. So if you've got like a program where you have some, let's say you have some administrative data living somewhere in your system or in another agency system, and you're able to access that or harmonize it such that someone continues to remain eligible for some sort of benefit, as long as rules allow, if you were to make that registration or re-registration automatic because they qualify, that would have a really powerful impact on the churn rate or the number of people who might accidentally drop out from receiving an important benefit, even though they're still eligible. Removing friction is another example, and I'll get into a worked example of this, but I mean, this is not a value judgment about any of you or me, but humans tend to be lazy. We don't like cognitive effort, and even really, really minor amounts of friction stopping us from doing something could, prevent us from following through on something that would be good for us or that we want to do. And this is especially true for folks like myself who are not neurotypical, and like I've got some executive dysfunction and attention issues. If there's like even minor friction stopping me from doing something, I might look away from that thing and forget I was ever working on it. And I think thinking about all the points of friction in government programs and policies is a really important way of trying to make things easy for folks. If you can remove even minor friction, it could make a difference. And the third is to make it easy, simplify messages. So something I like to do here is a flip test. So if you're working on a piece of communication that has a call to action, like you need someone to do something, take that communication that you've drafted, show it to a romantic partner, a sibling, a family member, a friend, and say, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to look at this and tell me what it's asking you to do, or tell me what the main message is. And flip it over for them, have them look at it for 30 seconds, take it away. If they can't tell you what they're supposed to do as a result of receiving that communication, you've failed the flip test. And there's a lot of research that simplifying messages, making it really easy for folks to understand what they need to do, can help folks follow through on specific behaviors. One quick example is, how can we reduce the hassle paying overdue taxes? We worked on a project with the UK government that encouraged people to pay their overdue taxes. The British version of the IRS, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, was working with people who hadn't filed their tax returns. And what they wanted to do was mail people a letter that said, you hadn't paid your tax bill, you're delinquent, please make sure to go to this website and fill out your tax return. This letter they were going to mail out tells people that they need to go to this website. And once they got to the website, they were responsible for finding the right form to fill out. What we did was make a really simple tweak to the letter. Instead of sending them to the web page and making them find the form, we just changed the URL in the letter to the form itself. So the link sent them directly to the form. We eliminated the friction here of literally one extra click. As a result of doing that, we know from our randomized control trial that we increase the rate of online tax filing by 4 percentage points. While this is a small number in a sense, it was a cost-free change. Like we changed the wording of a letter, and a 4 percentage point increase in this context represented hundreds of thousands of pounds in revenue brought forward, achieved by a simple change that didn't cost any extra money. So even the smallest amounts of friction, even a click, can prevent folks from performing a behavior. Let me take a brief drink of water here. The next part of this framework is like, if you want someone to do something, make it attractive. I have a little pop quiz. I've not been engaging you probably as much as I should, so prepare to be engaged. Okay. First question. Was Gandhi older or younger than 50 years old when he died? Please drop in the chat what you think. Okay, great. Second question. How old was he when he died? So you don't need to, you can put this in the chat if you want, or you can just think it to yourself. No Googling, I should have said that, but hopefully that's obvious. All right, I see lots of numbers coming in, very helpful. Second question, was Albert Einstein older or younger than 100 years old when he died? Okay, you already know the second question. How old was he when he died? Okay. Uh, I forgot to introduce Leah at the beginning of this. My colleague Leah is also on board. But just to say, if Leah and I took these numbers and tallied them and looked at them, um, uh, we might find an example of what's known as anchoring. So Gandhi was actually 78 when he passed away, and Einstein was 76. So think to yourself, if you guessed something for Gandhi that was lower than 78, or Einstein that was over 76, like ruminate a second on why you might have gotten to the number you got to. It may be due to a concept in behavioral science called anchoring, where if you're presented with a number that is relatively like meaningless in a sense, it still impacts your sort of reasoning. So basically what I did was anchor you for Einstein on this 100-year-old figure. And what our brains often do and when we're anchored is work down from, like if we think it's younger, we work down from 100 until we hit a number that starts to feel good and then plug that in. Or in the Gandhi example case, work up from 50 until we hit a number and plug that in. Researchers have shown that this anchoring effect is true for people who even know about it. So knowing about the anchoring effect doesn't protect you from anchoring. So, feel about that how you wish. But it's an example of like a number of concepts in behavioral science that you can use to make something attractive to somebody. So a couple of examples in this category are, grabbing attention visually. So if you want to draw people's attention to a call to action in a communication, it's really important that you've got good visual design and that call out is easy to see and salient or noticeable to people. You could do, there's like built environment examples of this too. So, using, let's say, a green pavement or floor coloring on the transit system in the UK to direct people where to stand when they're waiting for the subway to try to prevent congestion. Like there are lots of sort of examples of using visual cues to grab attention or to help direct folks. Personalization is a way of making things attractive. So we've done studies, and so have others, about like including people's names in communications or personalizing information to people. If you use folks' names, like sometimes that in itself is enough to keep their attention on something they might not have paid attention to otherwise. Rewards and incentives also fall into this category. So if you want to get folks to sign up for something or participate in something, a common thing to do is to run a lottery, which sort of capitalizes on the heuristic or bias that we as human beings overweight slightly unlikely outcomes. So we'll participate in a lottery even though there's a very small chance that we would win something, because it's fun and because, hey, we might win that thing. And sometimes setting something up as a lottery, so making, let's say, like a big prize available to people, might cause more people to participate in something than if you took the amount of money you had for incentives and you divided it into a whole bunch of small chunks. A third thing here is potentially catering to the ego or emotions, changing the framing of how you communicate things. So we've got a famous study, I say famous, niche famous for us, for Behavioral Insights team in this space, where we worked with a city many years ago to try and encourage folks to uptake or take up the use of free physical checkups. And we sent them text messages encouraging them to do this. And everyone going into this study thought a text message we had designed that said, do this check-in or do this checkup so you can care for your family, or be around to care for your family, like that sort of social motivation would work best. And what we found is that phrasing along the lines of "you've been selected for a free doctor's appointment" was actually more effective than this sort of like altruistic motivation. So sometimes like testing what sorts of framing might work best in a given situation could surprise you. An example in this space is just how can we, like a simple example we had with the city of like, how can we help settle outstanding parking fines because we want to help people avoid sort of collections or any more drastic measures to sort of capture this these amounts. We worked with a city to redesign a letter basically and to send an additional letter. So in the status quo, they were sending a letter at 45 days telling folks that their citation was overdue. And what we did was add an additional reminder to the process at 60 days. As you can see, redesigned to try to make it much more salient, like what we're asking the recipient to do. In this case, visit this URL and pay the $50. We found that the likelihood of paying any amount 30 days after receiving our letter made folks more than twice as likely to make a payment. And if that were scaled, this letter could bring forward an additional 100,000 for the city each year. And I believe in this case, they did scale it. So just an example of making something attractive. The third category is if you want someone to do something, make it social. We've evolved to be these incredibly social creatures, and we are affected by the behavior of others around us. There's a couple examples of this. One is using social norms. So if you draw attention to a social norm, it can help to convince folks who are not according with that norm to change their behavior. The insight being here that sometimes people do things that they think are relatively normal. And if they find out that it's not normal, actually, that they're in the minority of folks doing that thing, they're more likely to kind of change their behavior to accord with a norm, as long as the reference group makes sense to them or feels like a group that they want to be a part of. Messenger effects are another example of making it social. So you're right, Nancy. For some people, social norms can backfire, and the study of social norms around the world does have some cultural variation. Or there are always going to be folks who think of themselves as individuals and like to stand apart. And it may have age-specific heterogeneous effects. Jocelyn, I think you're right. So context is important for the use of social norms or any of these tools. Another example of making it social is messenger effects. So who's delivering the information matters a lot. You can think of examples from vaccination, where we know people's doctors are highly trusted messengers when it comes to getting vaccinated yourself or getting your kids vaccinated, versus you can think of some random other messenger telling you to get vaccinated with the exact same information. It's probably not going to be as persuasive as a doctor. Or we've got some work where we tested different messengers for trying to encourage survivors of domestic violence to take up help-seeking services, basically. And we had a client that thought that using a law enforcement messenger would be the most successful, and we tested other messengers like community leaders, like nurses, things like that, with the exact same information, and found that the law enforcement messenger was not the most successful in this specific context. So the messenger matters. And the final example is reciprocity and commitments. So we have a sort of heuristic or a bias wherein if someone does something for us, we feel compelled to return the favor. And so sometimes eliciting a sense of reciprocity can be helpful in encouraging folks to follow through on helpful behaviors. So as an example of that, we did a sort of work with job seekers who are out to try to return to the workforce. And we knew that attending a kind of job fair might help them increase the chance of getting a job. And so we tested messages that said like, "Hey, Adam, I'm holding a spot for you at this job fair next week. Please let me know if you can come," and then signed it with the name of the frontline worker in that case, and found that those messages were, versus the control, effective at helping folks actually show up to this job fair, because we had elicited the sense that like, hey, someone is actually holding a spot for me, like someone went through the effort of doing that. Example in this space, we were tasked in the UK with the NHS of helping to reduce the overprescription of antibiotics. So the NHS had dedicated a ton of funding to this problem, because overprescribing antibiotics in cases where it's not needed can help or can lead to people becoming resistant, or certain strains of infections or bacterial infections becoming resistant to antibiotics. And what we did was we identified doctors who were in the top 20% of prescribing rate in their local area, using data that the UK has publicly available. We randomly put those doctors into 2 different groups. One of them received a letter informing them that 80% of their peers prescribed fewer antibiotics, and the other half didn't receive a letter. The letter also included some simple ideas for actions they could take instead of prescription. And what we found in this case was that the treatment group prescribed less antibiotics than the control group. The letter intervention cost a fraction of the overall budget to reduce antibiotic prescribing. I believe the UK had set aside something like 23 million pounds to change the prescription rate, and their goal was to change it by a percentage point. The cost, the actual physical cost of like sending these letters was like £5,000, not counting the staff time from bit that went into designing these. And that got them about 85% of the way to their goal. And so, in this case, an example of a sort of simple intervention using this social norm concept that changed in this case the behavior of what you would think of as like a highly professional, evidence-driven person, or doctors. But I think part of the theory was that like doctors sometimes work in isolation from each other and don't have a big sense of like what each other is doing. So peer feedback in this case was, I think, helpful in that sense of like giving folks a sense of where they stood. The final part of this framework is if you want someone to do something, make it timely. A couple examples of that are prompts, planning, and discounting. So timely reminders can be super, super helpful in helping people follow through on a behavior. And you want those reminders to come at the right time. Like for me, if part of it is like I need to get out to the gym and I want to go at 4 p.m., if you text me at 7 a.m. in the morning about the gym, it's probably not going to be helpful. If you text me just before I'm intending to go, when my motivation is lapsing, like maybe it will be helpful. Or if you text me a couple days before something is due, that's probably going to be more helpful than if you texted me after it was due. Just giving people prompts can help them follow through on a behavior. Second concept here is planning. Planning, like we know from research that if you encourage people to go through the mental process of planning to do something, it can help them be more likely to follow through on that behavior. So, thinking about like what problems, like if I want to do something, what might I run into in the way to doing that? How might I overcome it? How will I actually follow through? Like that can be helpful in getting people to actually then doing the thing. And another piece of making it timely here is like discounting, which I could talk about for a long, long time, but basically like the present matters more to us than what happens in the future, or so we're sort of biased in that way. We're present biased, and there's a number of sort of other concepts in this space. But basically, like oftentimes the cost of doing something are a lot more salient than the benefits you might get in the future. So, if my payoff from going to the gym comes weeks from now when I'm in better shape, the costs of going to the gym and getting out the door today are more salient than that. So if you could help people think or bring the rewards to a kind of more present framing, oftentimes that can help. So an example here of like how can we help people follow through on a license renewal deadline? So we worked with the city of Denver to help people renew their licenses. Everyone received a mailer 6 weeks before the expiration date telling them to renew online and giving them the information to do that. We randomly assigned some of those folks to receive one of two types of postcards sent 2 weeks later. 1/3 only received the original mailer. As you can see in these postcards, we include these sort of like checklists and implementation intentions activities where we tell them exactly what they need to do to renew. And we ask them to basically make a commitment when they will actually renew and like write it in there. So idea being a simple prompt for helping people think through how they'll do something. And we found in this case, again, just a couple percentage point difference in the number of folks who ended up renewing their license compared to the control group. So I know I've got a couple minutes left here, and then I'm really excited to get into the discussion. But just in terms of conclusions here, behavioral insights can help us identify these sorts of predictably irrational ways that we as humans interact with policies and programs, and to work with those biases rather than against them, to bring this sort of evidence-based understanding of how humans behave, a more user-centered understanding to bear. Evaluation, which I didn't get into very deeply, but still I think want to highlight here, can help us narrow in on what works when and for whom. And understanding, if what we're trying to change is working or not. It doesn't have, these evaluations don't have to be too complicated either. You can make these simple changes to programs and sometimes reap rewards in terms of outcomes for or social impact for users. I, before I close here, did want to just briefly come back to the kind of full scope for applying behavioral science, because I think a lot of the examples I shared today, as I said, were like more in like low-hanging fruit, basically, for applying behavioral science to policies and programs, and ways that might get you thinking about what you could do with your own programs immediately. And so a lot of what I provided as examples fell in this sort of information provision bucket here on the left. And if I add this other sort of scale or this is the other sort of axis here, the sort of tactical or bottom left, this like information provision part of this visual here. So, changing the texts in appointment reminders to try to reduce no-shows is like a big example of what I shared. But I think the field has really gone beyond nudges at this point as well. And so there are lots of other applications that I'd be excited to talk to folks about that fall in some of these other categories that go beyond the tactical information provision to strategic information provision, like using regulatory power to improve the quality of information or consumer information on energy switching, or altering the tax structure for sugared drinks, which is something we help do in the UK to help change the behavior of drink formulators in terms of how much sugar they were including in their drinks, reducing friction costs to increase the uptake of a merit tax allowance also kind of falls in this economic incentives part of the behavioral science continuum. Automatic enrollment in pension schemes, I think, is something you can achieve through legislation and regulation, and makes use of that default that I introduced as a part of making things easy, or designing sort of the rollout of phasing for small businesses. I think also can form an example here, although we don't have time to get into that in detail. But just to say, I think behavioral science has sort of gone beyond just the examples I've shared today, even if those are oftentimes the easiest way to start getting into this and using it in your own work. So before I go to questions, the last thing I'll say is, I think if you talk to anyone who's applying behavioral science in their work, like folks recognize that it's just one tool that you can use, and it's not a replacement for traditional policymaking approaches. It's not a silver bullet or an end all be all. Like, it's not intended to be that. So I do want to be really modest in that sense, but I do think sometimes, thinking about end user behavior, being really sympathetic to end users and making small changes can help yield important improvements for folks.